I'm delighted today to be talking with Conor Kelly. Conor is Assistant Professor of Theology at Marquette University. And he works at the intersection of fundamental moral theology and applied ethics. He's the co-editor of Poverty, Responding Like Jesus, and the author of The Fullness of Free Time, a theological account of leisure and recreation in the moral life, which we'll be discussing today. So thank you for being here, Conor.
Great, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
So you mentioned in the introduction to your book that free time, which you define as time free from work, obligation, or any necessary activity, is not often the object of academic study. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is, you think?
Yeah, I think there's a couple pieces to it. I think one is that in at least the United States, we have a kind of tendency to assign value in typically utilitarian terms, especially a kind of economic utilitarianism. And so we often think about free time as this part that's separated from the things that normally generate the productivity that gives us our sense of worth and value. And so in that sense, it often has a dismissiveness to it. So I think that's one piece. The other piece, I think, is that it just has a basic ordinariness to it. It's almost like too common for us to really dwell on. And in the field where I work in theology, particularly in ethics, there's a sense that it might just be time to give people the space to have a little bit of what someone would call a moral holiday. Like, we have to make all these ethical decisions. We've got a whole lot of places we need to weigh our options. And isn't it nice just to take a break and kind of take a step back? And one of the things that I say in the book, and kind of what gave rise to the book as a scholarly project, is the sense that we actually need to do more in ethics, I would say in Catholic ethics in particular, but ethics more broadly, to engage those ordinary situations, because I think that it's in those spaces that if we actually give ourselves the time to reflect and think critically about what we're doing, we can cultivate the kinds of practices that help us discern well on those bigger, more obvious ethical quandaries. So for me, it's all interconnected. And I think the more that we can begin to see the ordinary aspects of lives as training grounds for the rest of our lives, the more significant it becomes. And that's what I'm hoping the book will do.
Thank you. So nowadays we often mix work and time off. So for example, I have to confess I was working on these questions while watching an NFL game on Sunday. So does that kind of mixing of what might have been more separate spheres kind of complicate your analysis of free time?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And one of the things that I am trying to articulate in the book is that we do ourselves a bit of a disservice when we do so much blending of things. Obviously, we have to blend at times. There's always overlap. But one of the tasks that I hope the book can facilitate is a kind of more intentional awareness of what we're doing with our free time, how we're using it, and how we can use it well. And when we have to do the work imposition side, I think that does make it a lot more complicated. In the chapter kind of talking about the structural effects constraining our free time, I talk a little bit about job spill in the way that and this is particularly true in a pandemic environment, you kind of have expectations in the job and it starts to push outside of the typical 9-to-5 boundary, if that was ever really typical to begin with, of course. But we start to see all of these additional pressures, and what does it mean to kind of reclaim some time as genuine free time that we're actually trying to engage for the fullness of it, and not for, okay, I know I need to do this thing, so I'll take care of that and count this as my free time because I have the game on in the background. How do we actually do what we need to do in the work context so that we can then enjoy the things that are outside of work and not feel guilty about that as though it's not work?
Right. Thank you. So you build your theological account on free time on a distinction between leisure and recreation as two different distinct types of free time. So can you explain that and tell us what's the theological distinction there?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to have kind of two categories, because as I think about free time, I feel like there's a difference between the kinds of free time activities that we really use in a way to help us prepare for our jobs so that we can go back to work and sort of be a better worker. And I would say that that was kind of how I was initially thinking about the value of free time, in a sort of vocational sense, adopting a Catholic view of the dignity of work and the significance of that as a way of contributing to society and of flourishing as human beings, I'm thinking, all right, this is a good thing. And there's a way of envisioning free time as rest as a necessary part of fulfilling that vocation, so that you can go back to work re-energized, for instance. And you would see somebody like Thomas Aquinas articulating this kind of vision as play or even recreation as a way of facilitating the kind of renewal of spirit and renewal of body. And this is sometimes how rest appears in Catholic social teaching. So that was kind of my initial foray into justifying my free time, if you will. And the more I thought about that, and the more I had some conversations with some of my colleagues, particularly in graduate school, someone said to me, well, you're trying to challenge this utilitarian assumption about the only thing that has value is if it has some productive contribution to make. But what you've just described is really the utilitarian interpretation of free time. Like, it's acceptable because it then allows you to go back to work and do a better job. And I thought, yeah, that's not really the message I want to send at the end of the day, because I think there's something more here. There's something significant to it. So I began to think a little bit more about free time, think about more of the sort of traditional leisure ideal in Aristotle and the kind of classics, and mine some of what they're trying to articulate. Joseph Pieper's a good illustration of this. He really describes an intrinsic value to leisure and tries to connect that in Joseph Pieper's terms with contemplation and celebration. And I was thinking, I want to preserve those insights, but I also want to make it a little bit more attainable. I think both Aristotle and Pieper, who's building on Aristotle, have this kind of really high ideal for what leisure is. And I do want it to be idealistic, but I also want it to be attainable. And so the more I kind of delved into that, the more I thought about, what does it look like to enjoy our free time for itself as an intrinsic good, or say that it has intrinsic value, rather than just thinking about it as something that facilitates our vocations. And that led to this distinction of leisure as the intrinsic good, and recreation is a more instrumental good, because it allows us to pursue some additional ends that are important. So in the book, I sort of develop those categories using this idea of flow from the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, whose name I am certain I just butchered. And his evaluation of flow comes from this really interesting study he did with experience sampling method. This was back in the late 80s and 90s and early 90s. So he was using beepers, and he would give subjects beepers and then ask them to record what they were doing and how they felt whenever the beeper went off. And so he would just get kind of a random sampling of people's days across the world. And what he found was that people from different cultures and different ages, different times, were all describing a kind of similar experience when they relayed that they were most engaged in what they were doing. And he describes this as a kind of optimal experience, and then following on some of their descriptions, describes it as a flow experience, because people would talk about being so engaged in their activity that they're kind of like carried on with the flow of what's going on around them. So I was really struck by both that description as an experience. One of the things that Csikszentmihalyi highlights is that this is autotelic in his language. People seek it for its own end, that they enjoy being in the flow state and they kind of look for it. So I thought, okay, there's an intrinsic element to it. And then the second piece he describes is that it really comes about when you can match challenge with skill in a particular activity. And that is often best facilitated by games, because those are the sorts of things that have clear parameters and you can adjust them. So I think about kids playing soccer. They get a smaller field, they have the same task, you've got to get the ball in the goal, but we can set it so that it's not quite as challenging, and that can kind of match skill level a little bit. Then the field grows as their skills grow, and so on. So for me, I'm thinking, all right, flow is this really fascinating intrinsic value to it. It's really associated with leisure. And the third piece that I realized was that it has a lot of parallels with the way that Christians talk about what we're expecting from heavenly rest, which has another parallel with leisure, of course, is this idea of resting. Because looking at somebody like Augustine, he'll talk about the way that resting in God kind of mimics God's rest on the Sabbath, which is this curious balance of both resting, peace, and activity. God is not like ceasing, God is not creating actively in that moment, at least as described in Genesis, but God is not ceasing the work of God. God is still allowing existence to continue to persist. So that kind of matches what happens in flow, because you're in the middle of some activity, but you get so focused on it that you almost feel like you're just being carried along, that you're almost at rest in the midst of an activity. So I play up this kind of connection in the book and develop it more, and talk then about how we can think about leisure theologically as having an intrinsic value because it gives those who take a Christian worldview a glimpse of what it is that they say they're hoping to experience in the afterlife. So much like liturgy provides this kind of foretaste of the heavenly experience in communion, so I think leisure can provide a kind of theological foretaste, a glimpse of heavenly rest. And that for a Christian is an intrinsic value. So I kind of carry that forward with another Augustinian distinction between enjoying goods like God and using goods for the sake of pursuing those goods that are to be enjoyed, and talk about what it might mean to theologically and ethically enjoy leisure as an intrinsic good and then use recreation as this instrumental good that facilitates our kind of growth and recovery. So long answer to a short question, but
no,
welcome to being a professor.
No, thank you. And I think you gave, a wonderful account of kind of the heart of the book, which is, I think, really helpful. Can I go in a slightly different direction from one of the questions which we've received, which is about gender? This participant asked, could you say more about how gender analysis might help us attend to not only feminized caring labor, but also how gender dimensions of emotional labor impact leisure availability?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot about the kind of structural effects on the economics of care side. So that the first piece of that, work, as I like to describe it, following kind of the Catholic tradition, is not just confined to the economic activity, but really is about the things that we do as humans to contribute to the flourishing of those around us. And care activities are probably the most important work in the Catholic understanding, I think. And we know, despite all the changes that have gone on in society, say in the last 100 years, there's still a dramatic burden of care work on women in particular, and there's a gendered dimension to that work. And so I definitely think about that as one of the structural constraints on leisure, and that's one of the pieces that I talk about in the book, that it's important to think not just about what we want to achieve individually, but also what are the structural effects that facilitate or frustrate other people's ability to have that same kind of experience. So I would say that those gendered expectations are really an important dimension of those structural pieces. And I would also note that when we think about kind of the spillover effects of work, I like the emotional labor comment, because as a parent, I often think of, there are dimensions to this job that just don't go away, right? And I'm sympathetic to the people who want to say, well, let's not too quickly align parenthood with work, because we want to not reduce our parenting to its economic potential. But at the same time, it's a lot of work. And when I think about free time, I think about ways that some of my interactions with my children really are free time, and some of my interactions with my children really are work. And I think the emotional labor, the spillover dimensions there are an important piece to try and keep in mind. And, I will attest to the fact that that has gender dimensions, and that is experienced differently for different people in different contexts. And that's one of the things that I do try and highlight in the book, is that there's really a subjective element to both the general distinction of leisure and recreation, and then the kind of follow through on how that plays out. So hopefully I've created space for that within the context of the book too. I think I could probably do more to be explicit on gender too, however.
Thank you. So I think we'll come on to talk a little bit more about the kind of the implications for individuals and how we spend our time. But I'm wondering if there are policy implications of your work. So in other words, are there material conditions that are necessary for us to truly experience leisure? And could you talk a little bit about what those might be, and what kinds of kind of policy changes might help us to kind of truly experience leisure?
Yeah, there's definitely large structural constraints on free time. And one of the things that I was very mindful of about writing a book on the ethics of free time is the way that can quickly devolve into a sort of bourgeois project. Like, oh, isn't that nice? You get to think about free time. I mean, this came to a head for me when I was, I had the nice luxury of a semester where I was not required to teach, so that I could do some research, and was working on this book. And so I remember distinctly having a conversation with new neighbors. We'd just moved, and they were saying, oh, so what do you do? And I'm explaining, oh, I'm a professor at Marquette. And they said, oh, well, how are the classes going? And I said, well, I'm not actually teaching right now. I'm spending my time writing a book about free time. And I just thought, as this conversation unfolded, like, I need to back up and explain that I'm not as much of a jerk as I sound right now. So how do I sort of ground this a little bit more succinctly? And that was really important in the project, because I do think there's a lot of value in a way to think about free time more critically. But as a number of people can attest, and probably all of you listening realize, that's a big ask to say, hey, why don't you just take some more time and think about how you use your free time? Because most of us feel like we don't have any free time at all. And so one of the things that I really dig into is, well, what kind of free time do people have, and how has that changed over time? How has the use of that changed over time as well? And what I note is that what's obvious to all of us, the biggest impact on our free time is going to be work and the constraints of paid employment. And not just, paid employment, obviously work is broader, but what I try and hit on in the book is a sort of, I call it the leisure paradox, that you have kind of at one end of the spectrum, people who have a lot of economic resources but don't have a lot of time. And then at the other end, you have people with fewer economic resources who often find themselves with more time because, say, they're facing significant unemployment and, have time but don't have the resources to do things with it. So what I talk about in the book are ways to try and address both ends of that kind of divide. And on the one half, I think a lot about what it would mean to facilitate work that allows people to make decisions about how much they wish to work. So I spent a good chunk of the kind of structure question around leisure talking about the living wage movement and what it would be and what it would require to have a living wage, and give a kind of theological justification for that, both in line with Catholic social teaching, but also generally in the context of thinking about these structures for leisure and how that can help facilitate, hopefully, a reduction in work hours for people who would like to take that, and then also enough just by typical work hours to be able to do things productively during leisure. And then I also, throughout the book, spend a lot talking about what we can do as a society to make genuine leisure opportunities more affordable, less kind of commodified, less dependent on economic input, and more a shared good collectively. On the other end of the spectrum, as I think about the kind of time poverty side of it, I talk about how, frankly, absurd it is that we have no real protections or no real guaranteed time off from work for workers. We have sort of overtime hours for certain types of workers, but no guaranteed paid vacation. And so I talk about that as an important thing. And then I also talk about paid parental leave as being a really important opportunity for people, because as I reflected on my own experience parenting, I really remember how malleable my life became in that moment. There were all the routines that I had before being a parent, and then when we had our first child, all those routines just disappeared, and it was everything else could kind of come into play. And so that seems like a moment where people can begin to kind of craft some of the routines if they actually have the time to do it. And that means support from paid employment so that we have the resources to not have to worry, where's the next paycheck coming for? How do I pay for this absurd amount of diapers that suddenly I now have to get on a monthly basis?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you. So we have a question that kind of builds on the question about gender, and it's about how you think about leisure, recreation, and play for children and young people. Do children and adults have a right to free time? Who guarantees that right?
It's a lovely question. I would certainly like to say we have a right to free time, and because I think it's intrinsic to our flourishing. And in terms of guaranteeing it, that becomes a little bit more challenging. But I suppose that's part of our larger debates about how we guarantee any of our rights. That's part of where I think about some of these policies like a living wage that would provide a kind of floor so that we can then say we've actually facilitated some of the freedoms to make these decisions. Thinking now about kind of piece I had done for the Berkeley Forum about universal basic income recently, and was in that context describing how that actually speaks to a way of facilitating some of these opportunities. It addresses some of the structural constraints too. So I think that some of our larger questions about how we've structured our economy, how we've structured our society, really come into play in this context. And if we can begin to talk productively about free time as a really valuable thing, beyond just, oh, well, it helps you be a better worker, then I think we can begin to shift some of those conversations about what it means to pursue and ensure a right like that. I hesitate on the right language a little bit because I think then you exactly have this challenge of like, well, right from whom, right how, what does it mean to assert a right? And so I kind of want to see us conversing probably a little bit more about the value or the goodness, the intrinsic or instrumental, and the potential of it, and also the importance of flourishing, and the sense that flourishing really is our fundamental right. We have this right to flourish collectively and individually, and we have some responsibilities to kind of pursue that. So my punt answer is it comes down to all of us at the end of the day.
Thank you. So I have a question that's essentially asking, it's saying that you described earlier how you're sensitive to the fact that as a middle-class person, and you say, I'm working on the subject of leisure, that could strike someone else as indulgent, let's say. So how do you go about being attentive to those concerns around class, and how do you communicate with people from different backgrounds, and how do you teach this material to students?
Yeah, the teaching material is really an interesting question. And this gets back to there hasn't been a lot written about this. So how do you even kind of bring it in? I've found that teaching with students has kind of allowed me to push them to think about what they're trying to do with their free time. And really what I end up focusing on is how would you think about an intrinsic value to what you're doing? Because so many of my students will really think about their time in a utilitarian transactional kind of sense. And that's the vein that they use to evaluate, am I going to do this or not do that? Like, should I waste the time going to this club, or should I spend the time studying this thing, or whatever it is? It's always, and this is kind of the college mindset for them, am I getting a good return on this investment? Because they realize that they're spending a lot of money at a private school like Marquette, and they need to sort of justify that. And I understand all of that. But when I push them a little bit, and I ask them to think about, all right, what do you really enjoy the most in your free time? So, and that's helpful in the conversation regardless of class, because that kind of allows people to talk about what's valuable to them without an imposition of, oh, well, do you like X, Y, or Z? And so I think that's a helpful start, and that's an inclusive start. And that then kind of prompts, okay, usually it's, I really appreciate the times I spend with my friends, or the time I'm able to FaceTime with my family, or something like that. And what it almost always comes back to is the relationships that they're able to build and cultivate in their interactions. And so then I can kind of mine with them together, well, what's so important about that? I mean, how is your mom going to feel if you say, oh, well, Mom, I really, really value our chats because I feel like they're helping me really hone my interview skills so that when I go out on the job hunt, I'm going to be able to look somebody in the eye and converse effectively. Maybe there's part of that, but at the end of the day, that's not all of it. And I think all of my students kind of come to that awareness too. They're like, no, that's not what it's about. I appreciate some of those elements, and I will use some of those things, but there's really a value in the relationship itself and in the connection that we cultivate. And so that, I think, is a really fundamental good. And that's when I talk about the fullness of free time effectively, both in leisure and recreation, that's really what I'm thinking about facilitating through our own personal reflective awareness, and also through some of these structural changes, so that we can have more of those relational connections and more meaningful interactions, and think about enjoying our free time as a time to flourish in our relational selves. So that for me is something that transcends the class dimension. And the question then becomes, what does the facilitation of that look like in different contexts? And what sort of constraints are there in different situations?
Thank you. I think that's really helpful in how to talk to people about this subject. So I have an interesting question about retirement. It's for some people, retirement is kind of as the participant puts it, a continuous time of leisure. And for these people, is there a moral obligation to use one's retirement generously?
That's kind of fascinating. I would think about it as probably back to flourishing again. So when I think about flourishing, when I teach about this kind of concept for students, I talk a lot about the idea that, at least in the Christian tradition, flourishing comes down to self-gift. And sort of, the model Christians will say Jesus fully human, fully divine. And when they talk about being fully human, it's not just sort of, oh, happens to have done all the human things, but like the fullness of our humanity is present from a Christian perspective in Jesus Christ. And how does Jesus live his life? He lives it quite selflessly, both in his ministry and then certainly culminating in his death. And that, I think, is a model for what it means to flourish as a human being. And this is certainly how Catholic theological anthropology would pitch what it means to be fulfilled. Gaudium et Spes talk about the human person being the only creature God willed for itself and can only find itself in a gift of self. And that, for me, is kind of what it means to live a human life and live it well. And I think at our various stages, that's probably what we ought to be aiming at. And so for many people, when at work, in terms of paid economic activity, we think of, hopefully, a kind of vocational sense of how can this be fulfilling in a way of serving others. Our kind of relational responsibilities, which is another dimension of our work that goes beyond the paid activity, really is about facilitating that same kind of flourishing. And I think we do well in our relationships when we can be kind of in this mutual self-giving context. And I guess I would think about retirement in a similar kind of vein. What are the opportunities for that same kind of self-gift? Because I think that's how we realize ourselves and our true identity as humans. So is it a moral obligation to be generous with your time, per se, or with your resources in retirement? I think that can probably get hashed out for the individual depending on the context. But I would say the overall aim does remain, how can I give myself to others? How can I contribute to the well-being of this community in which I live? And that free time, both leisure and recreation, can facilitate that if we take the time to pursue it.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, I know you finished writing the book before the pandemic, but has the pandemic kind of changed how you think about the topic? Has it complicated it in any way?
I think some of the job spill elements have certainly complicated it. I do remember when the shutdown began back in March, thinking, oh my gosh, wouldn't it have been better if I'd had this book together, had actually gotten my act together and written everything faster so that it was out here, because everybody has a bunch more free time and wondering what to do with themselves. And then I looked at the book and I thought, well, some of this is maybe not aging as well as I wanted in the midst of a pandemic. There was a whole section on spectator sports, for instance, and one of the things I talk about is how for various reasons that are really interesting, and you should buy the book and read about them, there's probably a kind of priority that goes sports in person with others, sports not in person with others, like watching together, and then the sort of like least fulfilling, at least in the model of the fullness of free time, would be like, I'm just sitting watching a game alone. And obviously now a lot of those things are difficult. Spectator sports, there's a whole box of worms around what that means for spectators and the kind of complicity that we now have in the pressures. The Big Ten just announced that they're going to do football, for instance. And I think, so to pull those pieces together, on the one hand, some of the specifics that I have sort of envisioned as a way of addressing things in the book look a little bit different in a pandemic. We're not going to all go hang out together and cheer on a sports team in person in a stadium of 80,000 people, as we might have once done, for very good reasons. And on the other hand, the kind of pieces that are structuring the analysis, I think, are still very strong. So one of the things that I do talk about is the sense of solidarity that people ought to have with those who are playing a spectator sport. So if you're a spectator, you ought to be thinking not just about your well-being and the well-being of spectators, but the well-being of the people that are playing for your enjoyment. And that's a question that has new layers now in the case of pandemic bubbles, and for college athletes, certainly college clusters and everything else. So I think that kind of analysis, the sense that we ought to be using our free time to fulfill our relationships, that piece I would preserve absolutely. And I think that can provide some guidance as we think about what we're doing with newfound free time, to the extent that we have some additional elements. But the hashing out of that obviously looks a little bit different when you can't get together in the same way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to thank you for being here today. This has been a really fascinating discussion. And thank you again for your time today. Not free time, but thank you for your time. This has been wonderful.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm so excited about the book. So thanks for all of your work at the press to get it out there.
You're welcome. Thank you for writing it. It's a real pleasure to publish it. So I will say goodbye to everyone for now. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you again soon on Books for a Better World. Take care. Thanks again.